Welcome. Thank you for being with us. I have with us Bobby Forte, and he is going to take us on a historical journey with this unique tool that you've put together from our history, from our past. With the Fables of John Shackle, right?
Yes.
The Fables of John Shackle. So, before we jump into the fables and how you use this as a learning tool, can you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how this project came to be?
Yes. A little about me is that I started out as a teacher and actually a history teacher. And I really got to understand the how history influences what we do every day, but we don't necessarily notice a lot of those ways. We kind of grow up and then figure out, oh, this is the way it is because of what someone else did. And those things really got me to a point where I wanted to go back and review and find out, well, what were the things in our culture that were very powerful beyond the ideas of the names and the dates in the history books, to relate those to stories. So I started to start with my family first. And of course, I've read through many of the stories that were out there, but I noticed that there was something that was a little different sometimes in how the stories were presented with a lot of fables. They had a lot of value in them, but none of them really touched specifically to the experience. And I remember having a conversation with my mother, and she would talk about her father, my grandfather. My family's from DeRidder, Louisiana, Galveston, Texas, those areas, and she said, don't be pulling on people's shackles. And I asked her when I was younger, what do you mean? And that came from stories that my grandfather heard of, if you're talking about things that make people uncomfortable or talking about their freedoms, if you bring those types of conversations up, it makes people uncomfortable. And if somebody is comfortable in their position or in their shackles, you don't want to talk about those things. So when those things come up, I said, don't be pulling on your people's shackles. So where did the story come from? And so apparently those things kind of culminated into the idea of what John Shackle was. So I kind of went to look and kind of ask, and nobody really, it wasn't something that had become a actual folklore connection. So I started to listen and try to find where the stories were coming from. And I started to hear the patterns of some of the things that my grandfather was talking about. And to see them consistently, I thought, okay, these kind of need to be put down in a format where we can review them. And that's where the source of it came, is from reviewing those same patterns of stories or conversations of experiences that we haven't really put down on paper. Most of it has been kind of oral through those experiences.
Just the importance of knowing the history so you could see where it came from. That's quite interesting. Don't be pulling on other. I like that saying because a lot of people have a lot of different shackles that they don't want you to mess with.
Right.
So my understanding is that you have been using these fables as a learning tool. And before we jump into the fables, can you tell me a little bit about how you've been using it as a learning tool?
Yeah, so I've been giving presentations in my community, and those presentations have really been focused around the context of John Shackle, the folklore character, in that he was a man that was enslaved but got his freedom, and he got into some bad situations by trying to tell other people about those types of freedoms. And so he decided to tell those stories in a way where only people that had similar experiences would connect to those ideas. So those are really how I tried to continue to use the stories. As we would meet, I would tell a story. I would ask what the story meant to the person and how they connected to it. And it allowed us to have those conversations without necessarily bumping heads on the details that we run into a lot of times. Uh, One person's experiences versus another. One example right now that we have a lot of time that's a light example is Michael Jordan versus LeBron James. We're going to argue for the next 20 years about that, but what are the principles behind what makes each player valuable to that person? And these stories kind of help clear out the clutter and get to some of those details that were very valuable in understanding why certain people were important. And
Okay.
they went really well.
Okay, well, I believe it because in reading some of the fables, some of them I got like instantly. Others I am really interested in seeing which ones fables you have chosen to share the learning from and to share with our audience. So I'm going to turn this part over to you to kind of like lead me into what fables you would like to talk about and how what learnings came from that fable in your group sessions.
So yeah, this one, the patient spider.
The patient spider,
Yeah.
yes.
A spider found the perfect spot to make a web. It saw a fly that would be easy to catch. The spider decided not to catch the fly immediately, but to be patient. The fly built its home and invited more flies. Soon the whole area was filled with happily bustling flies. Then the spider placed its web and was full for many weeks.
I was like, wow, what planning. And I was just really interested into what that meant in the context of these being fables coming up from slavery because I was trying to wrap my mind around it from that standpoint, as well as I wanted to also know what was said about it in your work group.
Yes, so when I read that one, the first response is, well, oh goodness, that's a bad ending. Well, I don't like that story. And the twist with the fables is that they may be hurtful on the surface level, but they're designed to teach a lesson. And when connecting this to African Americans, we have to learn from our good and bad lessons.
Mhm.
And sometimes the lessons that hurt us are the most valuable to us because we need to learn them so we won't make that same mistake.
Exactly.
So this story goes in a lot of directions. Um, One of the main ones is, of course, well, what I get all the time, it just surprised me like crazy the first time I heard is somebody immediately jumped out and said, gentrification, that's gentrification. They waited, we built the houses, and then they took everything. And then I hear Tulsa, it's Tulsa, and I never perceived that as the first response from the stories. But if it comes on
I
that
see
quick,
that though.
yes, it comes on that quickly to say, okay, well, if we're talking about a real experience, what did we do in that situation and what could we have done better? And so we look at Tulsa, most of our focus would be on what was done to us.
Mhm.
But we never really realized, like the fly, what things that we need to change in our situation to prepare for something like that to keep it from happening again. And
Mhm.
so once that story comes around, people will say, well, we were by a water source. We did have a lot of value. We were growing a lot of things. We had a whole community. We had a whole small city, and they took it. And some people say, well, what kind of defense did we have? Were we ready for those types of things to go on? What 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 should we have had in place to not think that this is a possibility?
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
starts to put the accountability not just on us but on our situations when we have something valuable, and what are we doing to make sure if we have something valuable, can we protect it?
Right.
because
No,
oh
I was
yeah,
just going to say, when you're the first to do something, there's no way I come out of fashion design, right? So we make prototypes. So when you make the first prototype, you see what you need to fix and how you need to adjust it for the next prototype. So for me, Tulsa would be the first prototype, and they created a really successful prototype, but they had no idea of the environmental factors that could affect it. So now 100 years later, we can look back at that prototype and say, "Oh wow, they did a really good job of building the structure and the infrastructure." But now, if we were to do that again, we would know we would have to build up a defense mechanism around it, you know. And there is no, you build a space shuttle, no matter what you're doing, you have to have that first prototype in order to know what you need to do for the next one and the one after. So yeah, I see that, because when I hear this, as I said, I was trying to put that fable in the context of slavery, and I was really having a problem connecting it. I thought I understood it, like, straight up, but as soon as you said Tulsa, and there's Tulsa, there's Redwood, there's Greenboro, North Carolina, there are places where that has happened numerous times. No fault of those people, because they didn't have the information structure that we had to know that it was happening someplace else. But now we have all of those different prototypes of people that have built, but they didn't see the spider up in the corner watching you build, just waiting to pounce on you. Uh, so yeah, to me, yeah, that is dead on for that. That is dead on. Yes,
and
I see that.
and like you
That's
said,
clear.
the power of knowing that the spider is there, not necessarily building in fear, but just knowing that there's possibly a spider there, and
Yeah.
you don't have to get caught in the conversation. Well, who is the spider? Show me the spider. Show me. It's the idea that you build with understanding the possibility of it, and that helps mitigate some of the errors and the mistakes that we deal with going through life. So
Hmm.
a it's not a bad thing to be
Right.
aware of those defenses and
Right.
possibilities.
And then you, again, you will, it's a lot like the computer system, right? Soon as they fix one set of weak spots, there's somebody figuring out how to create another virus or another way, another hack. So it's always going to be this perpetual improvement, and knowing that no matter what you build, there's somebody out there looking to destroy it. So you
Hmm.
build with the understanding that everyone doesn't have your best interest at heart, and there's always going to be someone around to destroy it, no matter if you're saying, who is the spider? The spider is irrelevant. Just the understanding that there is someone that's not going to be on your side. There's always going to be someone that's not on your side.
Yes, those types of things are guiding principles when we do certain things. There's another story in here called Above the Clouds, which touches on that a little bit, to the idea of when you have something, you may not know that it has value of it until a couple generations later. And then by that time, someone has come up and taken the idea from you.
And that one is kind of near to me, because what I see happening, I think I shared with you in our first conversation, is this whole idea of minimalism, right? Which was started by a man named Adolfo Lowe's. And by all accounts, his motivations were racist. You know, he believed that people that had adornments, prints, and colors, and all of this were of lower intelligence. This conversation began over 100 years ago, and it was never able to really take off or really take shape because there were so many societies that love their ornamentation, uh, whether it's European or African, Asian, whatever. Usually it was more from the standpoint of the European population that was saying, no, we like our ornamentation, right? So his minimalism didn't really take off then. But now I see 100 years later the idea that for it to be sophisticated and for it to be elegant, it has to be white or, lack any kind of connection to history and culture. So our kids are coming up with that understanding that their cultures are not elegant, their cultures are not beautiful. The adornments and those things are kitschy or low class. And what I genuinely believe is that this generation might not see it, but by the time the next generation sees it, trying to figure out how to reclaim those things are going to be extremely challenging,
Mhm.
if at all possible. So, yeah, that was another story that, you see what the past says and you see it being illustrated right here in the present.
Yeah, one of the valuable things about that story also is the idea of a title of identification. A lot of times we will say, look, we don't like the titles, we don't like being categorized, these things are not good for us. And in a lot of ways, those titles have hurt us, they're used against us. But a lot of times we have to make our own titles and identify it first. So in that story, the concept was the value was that it was identified, and the third eagle put their name on it. And when I would talk to a lot of my students, I would tell them that when you think of a lot of things that we've discovered in society, they have names. For one example, like we would say Alzheimer's disease, and I say, do you know what Alzheimer's? Most of them will say Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's. And that name is the name of the man that identified what it was. And they named it after him. So when you go back in history, you're saying his name. And so the concept of the name lives forever. So everyone that is connected to that will say, we know who Alzheimer is. And when we have things that are valuable, when we don't name them, the spider comes along, takes it, and says, I'm going to name it. And
Yes.
everything after that is going to look in the way I want it to be named. So, like what you said with shaping the reality, when they put a title on it, they decide what it looks like is the standard.
Exactly. And that's it. When you say we don't want to be labeled as black, for example, and I understand both sides of the argument. However, there are several things that happen. First of all, your information is much harder to find for me if I say I'm looking for fables. I'm not going to find your fable if I put in fable. You would be on page 1 million of Google search, right? Because it's going to give every other fable before I get to you. So by not identifying your fables as Black fables, makes you almost impossible to find.
Mm-hmm.
One, it also gives other people the opportunity to take it, you
Mm-hmm.
know, um, what is it? Reappropriate it
Mm-hmm.
as something that it was, because it was never identified as where it came from. It was never labeled. It was never identified as the source. So it can be reappropriated. We see it all the time with like TikTok videos. I used to sell Black art in the 90s, and the Black artists were really thriving and doing well. It became a thing. And then all of a sudden, the artists started getting undercut because they were flooding the market with cheap knockoffs of things that look like Black art, but they were never done by Black artists.
Mm-hmm.
So all these fables kind of work together to show you recognize you need a protective layer, because you're always seeing where it's going to be taken away. It started with physical property, now it's intellectual property. And it was always intellectual property because there was a ton of that too. But these fables are excellent to connect what happened in the past to what is still happening now.
And they're a valuable guideline. So in a lot of conversations where uh, like you said, we get into the argument of titles or names or labels. And it's hard to get through to a young person by saying, okay, well, this is valuable. You need to see the value of it. And you give them an example, and then they try to just argue your example down and say, well, this isn't like this isn't like that, this is. But when you give them the principle of the spider and the fly, or the above the cloud story, then they have nothing to argue about that's outside the context of the story, and say, do you understand what happened to the fly? Do you understand what the spider did? If you are going to move forward, you're going to end up in that fly's position, and you need to understand what to do. So for small children, or not just small children, for all of us really, just to be aware of that principle, that once we get older, if we're doing something, it's like, well, do you know this story? Do you know that story? It immediately puts you in the right mindset to where you're thinking about the value of what you're doing, and how to protect it, and how to keep it yours. So
Yeah.
they've been very valuable.
Yeah, yeah, that is I can see that. This has been wow. Yeah, these are um they are quite a learning tool, and I would love I would love to work with you on maybe doing some sort of webinar around this conversation, because I believe that this is a conversation that's well worth having, because there is that gap between, the new generation gap, right? Between this let go of all the learnings of your parents, because this new way works. I don't believe I don't believe all of anything is right, right? So there's growth that needs to come out of the learnings from the parents, but there's also some evolution that younger people bring to the conversation. So how do we marry the two things together so
Mhm.
everybody is growing and understanding and becoming the best that they can be?
Yes, these give us, man, that what you said, that's where they really shine, is just putting everything together, like with the captured horse story. It brings everyone to one experience.
Yes.
One thing is say, okay, if we grew up going through the civil rights movement, we know it was like, we know what it was like living in segregation. We know what it was like to have our own communities in those and our stores. The younger ones said we don't know what that looks like. Well, we've never been in a place that's been successful in all us. That experience of saying we can start from the story of the captured horse and say these are one of the valuable things from our position and these are the valuable things from your position. Speaking through that experience allows us to see the same thing, because not all times do we see the same thing. The biggest example is music. They say, look, the music y'all got now, y'all can't sing, y'all don't know how to write, y'all don't know how to do it. And then the younger kids say, well, I like this music, I think they can sing, I think that. And there's no way to train a young person's ear or change an older person's ear to say what really is music. But if you have one experience to say, okay, you understand what the story said, I understand what the story said, where's your point of view, here's my point of view, how can we meet and move forward?
Yes, yes. Well, this has been an absolute wonderful conversation, and um, I will put all the information where people can get a of this book. And I would love to work with you for us to put together a webinar for the audience to participate in this, because I do believe this is a learning tool. It's an intergenerational learning tool, and I look forward to working with you.
Yes,
Is
thank
there
you.
anything you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Uh, Really just thank you all for listening. If you're unsure, get the stories, read them. I'm telling you, there's value in them because they give you insight to reassess the positions that we're all in, but that we all share together. So there will be stories you don't like, but you'll say, why don't I like that story? There are stories you will like. Well, why do you like these stories? But they're all based on our experiences that we don't really get to have in our spaces without there being an outside force that influences what's said, how it's said, where it's said, and who it's said to. So these give a very valuable way to have those conversations and think about how we can move forward as a people.
Okay, well, thank you. And I thank you so much for putting this together, because it has historical value, from the historical records perspective, as well as it has this intrinsic value that every generation should be carrying these understandings and these principles, because if we don't know our history, it's destined to be repeated. So
Mhm.
if we don't know how to protect ourselves against things that come against us, then we won't see them coming the next time.
Right.
So I thank you so much um, for the passion that put this together, and it was wonderful talking to you. And I will definitely be in touch with you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank my special guest, Bobby Forte, for putting together this wonderful learning tool, The Captured Horse. Please check out his website and pick up your copy. This has been Read This, Author's Corner. I am your host, Alice Maria James. Keep reading, keep growing, and stay empowered.